There is a quiet truth about avoidance that almost nobody talks about. People assume they move on quickly. They assume they don't care, that they forget, that they detach and never look back. But deep inside their silent world, there is often one person who never truly leaves. One face, one voice, one presence that stays in the back of their mind long after everyone else has faded. And the strange part is, it's almost never the person who loved them the most, chased them the hardest, or tried the most to keep them. It's a very specific type of person, the kind who didn't demand, didn't cling, didn't push, the kind who felt like space instead of pressure. That is the person avoidants stay obsessed with, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime. Not in an obvious dramatic way, not with late night confessions or emotional messages, but in quiet thoughts, in comparisons, in memories that surface at the most unexpected moments. And the reason behind this obsession isn't romantic. It isn't even about love the way most people painted it. It's rooted in fear, safety, and the strange way the avoidant heart learns to attach without ever admitting it. Avoidants are wired to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm. Deep intimacy feels dangerous to them even when they crave it. So when someone enters their life and starts demanding closeness, reassurance, or emotional depth, their instinct is to retreat. It doesn't matter how kind or loving that person is. The more intense the emotional pull, the stronger the avoidance urge to escape. But there is one type of person who slips past these defenses without triggering alarms. This is the person who doesn't chase, the one who doesn't push for constant connection, the one who doesn't question every silence or demand explanations for every emotional distance. To the avoidant, this person feels different. They feel safe, not because they offer intense love, but because they offer freedom. And freedom, to an avoidant, feels like oxygen. When someone allows them to come and go emotionally without pressure, the avoidant relaxes. Their guard lowers. They don't feel trapped, so they don't feel the need to run. And in that relaxed state, something rare happens. They start forming a quiet attachment without even realizing it. The avoidant may never say it out loud, but the person who gave them space becomes special in a way they can't easily replace. This person didn't try to fix them, didn't try to pull emotions out of them like a confession. They simply existed beside them calmly without making demands. And that calm presence leaves a mark. Because for the avoidant, most relationships feel like emotional storms, expectations, conversations, confrontations, emotional highs and lows. But this one person felt like still water, no waves, no pressure, no suffocating closeness, just a quiet understanding. And that kind of connection is rare for someone who fears intimacy. So even if the relationship never became deep or serious, the emotional imprint stays. It lingers in the background of their mind like a soft echo they can't quite silence. Another reason this obsession forms is because the connection often feels unfinished. Avoidants are known for leaving before things get too intense. They pull away, create distance, or let the relationship fade instead of confronting their emotions. But when they walk away from someone who made them feel safe, something inside them remains unsettled. There is no dramatic breakup, no final conversation, no emotional closure, just a quiet ending. And that quiet ending becomes a loop in their mind. They replay moments, wonder what could have happened, and imagine different versions of the story. Not because they're openly emotional, but because unfinished connections bother the part of them that secretly longs for stability. The person who didn't pressure them becomes a symbol of what a relationship could have been if fear hadn't gotten in the way. And here's the part that shocks most people. Avoidants don't obsess over the person who loved them the most. They don't fixate on the one who sacrificed everything for them. In fact, those relationships often trigger their fears the strongest. Intense love feels like responsibility. It feels like expectation. It feels like a weight they're not ready to carry. So instead of cherishing it, they run from it. But the person who gave them emotional freedom doesn't create that fear. There is no pressure to perform, no constant demand for reassurance, no heavy emotional expectations. And because of that, the avoidant associates this person with peace instead of anxiety. Over time, that peaceful memory becomes something they hold on to quietly, not in a romantic, dramatic way, but in a subtle, almost unconscious way. Sometimes years pass, and the avoidant moves on to other relationships. They meet new people, form new connections, and go through different emotional experiences. But every so often, they think of that one person again. Maybe it's during a lonely night. Maybe it's after an argument with someone new. Maybe it's when they feel emotionally overwhelmed and wish they could just breathe. And in those moments, the memory of that calm, understanding presence, not because it was the deepest love they ever had, but because it was the safest. And safety is what the avoidant heart values more than anything else. The truth is, avoidants don't easily attach to people who try to pull them closer. They attach to those who let them stay exactly where they are. The ones who respected their distance without turning it into a problem. The ones who didn't make them feel broken or inadequate. The ones who simply accepted the silence, the space, the emotional walls. That acceptance creates a quiet bond. And once that bond forms, it becomes incredibly hard for the avoidant to forget. But they rarely admit this. On the outside, they may seem unaffected. They may act like everything is fine, like the past doesn't matter. They may even convince themselves that the person was never that important. But deep down in the quiet corners of their mind, that one connection stays alive. Not because it was perfect, not because it was intense, but because it felt safe in a way they rarely experience. And that is the shocking reason avoidants stay obsessed with one specific type of person. It's not about who loved them the most. It's not about who tried the hardest. It's about who made them feel free instead of trapped, who made them feel understood without pressure, who allowed them to exist without forcing their heart open. That is the person who lingers in their thoughts long after everyone else is gone. And even if they never reach out again, even if they never say a word, that quiet obsession often never truly fades. And even when the avoidant tries to convince themselves that the memory means nothing, it keeps resurfacing in small, quiet ways. It shows up in the people they compare others to. It shows up in the moments when someone new demands too much and they suddenly remember what it felt like to be with someone who didn't. They may not consciously think, I miss that person, but the feeling appears anyway, a subtle sense that something is different now, that something once felt calmer, lighter, easier. The avoidant might not have called it love back then, but their mind stores the memory as something valuable, something safe. And once their heart labels someone as safe, it rarely lets that label go. This is why avoidants often compare new relationships to that one quiet connection, not out loud, not dramatically, but internally. When someone becomes emotionally intense, they feel the pressure building. When someone asks too many questions, they feel their walls rising. And in those moments, the memory of that calm, non-demanding person returns. It becomes a silent benchmark, a quiet what if that lives in the background of their thoughts. What if they had stayed? What if they had tried harder? What if fear hadn't made them run? These questions don't always form into clear sentences, but they exist as emotions, subtle, lingering emotions that keep the obsession alive. What makes this even more complicated is that avoidants often don't realize they're attached. Their mind protects them by downplaying emotional bonds. They tell themselves it wasn't serious. They say it was just a phase. They convince themselves they didn't really care, but their actions tell a different story. They keep checking that person's social media from time to time. They remember small details about them years later. They compare new partners to them without noticing. These are the quiet signs of attachment, the kind that lives under the surface, hidden even from the avoidant themselves. Another reason this one person becomes unforgettable is because they saw a rare side of the avoidant. Avoidants don't open up easily. Most people only see their distant, independent, emotionally guarded exterior. But sometimes when they feel safe enough, a softer side appears. It might be small, a deeper conversation, a moment of vulnerability, a rare confession about their fears or past. These moments are unusual for an avoidant, and they don't happen often. So when someone witnesses that side of them, it creates a unique emotional imprint. The avoidant may not even realize how significant it was, but their mind does, and that person becomes tied to the memory of a version of themselves they rarely show the world. This creates a strange kind of attachment. It's not loud or obvious. It doesn't come with constant messages or emotional declarations. It's quiet, internal, almost invisible, but it's powerful in its own way because it's not based on intensity or drama. It's based on comfort. And comfort is something avoidants don't experience often in relationships. Most connections feel overwhelming, demanding, or emotionally heavy. But this one felt different, and that difference makes it hard to forget. There's also a deeper psychological reason behind this obsession. Avoidants are used to emotional distance. It feels normal to them. Familiar, even. So when they meet someone who naturally maintains a similar emotional rhythm, it feels like home. There is no clash between closeness and distance. No constant push and pull, just a quiet alignment, and that alignment creates a sense of emotional harmony. It doesn't overwhelm them, it doesn't scare them, it simply exists. And because it doesn't trigger their fears, it slips deeper into their subconscious. But here's the painful part. Avoidants often realize the value of this connection too late. At the time, they may not recognize how rare it is. They might assume they'll find someone similar again. Someone else who feels just as safe, just as easy, just as calm. But as time passes and new relationships bring familiar emotional pressures, they start to notice the difference. They start to realize that not everyone feels that way. Not everyone gives them the same sense of quiet freedom. And that's when the memory of that one person becomes more vivid. It's not always regret. Sometimes it's just a soft curiosity, a quiet wondering about what that person is doing now, whether they're happy, whether they found someone who treated them better, whether they still think about the avoidant at all. These thoughts don't come with dramatic emotion. They come gently, almost like passing clouds, but they return again and again over the years. And in their loneliest moments, that memory becomes even stronger. Avoidants may not admit it, but they do feel loneliness. They just experience it differently. Instead of reaching out, they retreat further into themselves. They distract their mind, focus on work, hobbies, or independence. But sometimes late at night or during quiet periods in life, the loneliness becomes impossible to ignore. And that's when the thought of that one person surfaces again. The one who made things feel lighter. The one who didn't demand more than they could give. The one who made connection feel safe instead of suffocating. In those moments, the avoidant may feel a subtle ache, not intense heartbreak, but a quiet longing, a sense that something meaningful slipped through their fingers without them fully understanding it. And because avoidants struggle with emotional expression, that longing often stays trapped inside. It doesn't turn into a message or a phone call. It just becomes another silent memory they carry with them. Over time, this one person becomes a reference point in their mind. Every new connection gets compared, even if the avoidant doesn't notice it consciously. If someone feels too intense, they retreat. If someone feels too distant, they lose interest. And deep inside, they're still searching for that same quiet balance they once felt, that same emotional space, that same calm presence. But because they never fully acknowledged what that connection meant, they struggle to recreate it. And so the obsession continues quietly in the background of their life, not as a dramatic love story, not as a painful heartbreak, but as a soft, persistent memory. The person who didn't chase, the person who didn't pressure, the person who simply existed beside them without trying to change them. That is the person avoidants carry with them long after everyone else has been forgotten. And as the years move forward, that quiet memory doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the avoidance emotional landscape, almost like a distant place they once visited but never returned to. They don't talk about it. They don't analyze it deeply, but it stays there somewhere in the background, influencing how they see people and how they experience connection. Every time someone gets too close, they feel the urge to step back. And without realizing it, they remember the one person who didn't make them feel that way, the one who allowed them to breathe. Avoidants rarely admit that they miss someone. Missing someone requires emotional acknowledgement, and that's something they're trained to avoid, but the feeling still exists. Just in a different form, it shows up as curiosity, as comparison, as a quiet thought that surfaces during still moments. They might be walking alone, sitting in a car, or staring at their phone, and suddenly a memory appears, a simple conversation, a peaceful moment, a feeling of ease. And for a brief second, they feel something they can't quite name, not full regret, not heartbreak, just a soft awareness that someone once made life feel lighter. That's because the person they stay obsessed with usually entered their heart without noise. There was no dramatic love story, no overwhelming emotions, no intense push toward commitment. It was subtle, quiet, natural, and that kind of connection is dangerous in a different way for an avoidant. Not because it triggers fear, but because it slips past their defenses. When someone doesn't push them, they don't feel the need to protect themselves. So their guard lowers, and once the guard lowers, even slightly, attachment begins to grow. But avoidants often don't notice attachment while it's happening. They're not the type to sit and reflect on their emotions in real time. They realize things later, sometimes much later. At the time, they may think everything is casual, simple, or temporary. They may even walk away from the connection without a second thought. But after time passes, the emotional weight of that bond starts to reveal itself, and that's when the obsession quietly begins. What makes this even more powerful is the sense of emotional freedom that person represented. To most people, love feels like closeness, intensity, and shared vulnerability. But to an avoidant, love often feels like expectation, responsibility, and emotional pressure. So when they meet someone who feels like open space instead of a cage, it leaves a deep impression. That person becomes associated with relief, with calm, with the rare feeling of being accepted without demands. And the human mind has a way of holding on to whatever made it feel safe. Even if the avoidant doesn't consciously think about it, their subconscious remembers. It stores that person as a symbol of emotional ease. So whenever life becomes overwhelming or relationships start to feel suffocating, their mind drifts back to that memory, not because they're trying to go back, but because that memory represents peace. Sometimes the avoidant meets someone new who seems promising. At first, everything feels exciting, fresh, different. But as emotional closeness begins to grow, the familiar pressure returns, the expectations, the deeper conversations, the need for reassurance. And slowly, the avoidant starts to feel that old urge to retreat. That internal alarm starts ringing again. And in that moment, the comparison begins. The new person feels intense, heavy, demanding. And the memory of that one calm, understanding presence feels even more valuable. This is why avoidants often seem emotionally disconnected in new relationships. It's not always because they don't care. Sometimes it's because nothing feels quite as safe as that one connection they had before. And because they never fully processed that attachment, it continues to influence them quietly, subtly, but consistently. Another reason the obsession lasts is because avoidants rarely get emotional closure. When relationships end, they don't usually sit down for long conversations about feelings. They don't express everything they felt or ask for answers. They leave quietly, or they emotionally detach until the connection fades. This means many of their relationships end without a clear emotional conclusion. But when the connection was calm and safe, the lack of closure becomes more noticeable over time. Their mind starts to wonder about the unfinished story, not in a dramatic romantic way, but in a quiet, reflective way. They might think about what would have happened if they had stayed, if they had opened up more, if they had allowed the connection to grow instead of stepping back. These thoughts don't consume them every day, but they return often enough to keep the memory alive. And because avoidants are so private with their emotions, these thoughts stay locked inside. No one sees them. No one hears about them. On the outside, they may seem completely unaffected by the past. They may appear independent, strong, and emotionally distant, but inside there is often one memory that still holds a quiet place in their heart. What makes this even more complex is that avoidants sometimes try to recreate that feeling with other people, not consciously, but through their choices. They may feel drawn to people who are emotionally distant, independent, or hard to reach. People who don't demand much. People who keep a certain level of space. And when they find someone like that, they feel comfortable again. But the connection often lacks the same quiet understanding they once experienced. Something feels slightly off, slightly different, and the comparison continues. Because deep down, it was never just about emotional distance. It was about emotional safety, about someone who respected their space without making them feel cold or broken. Someone who stayed calm without becoming detached. Someone who accepted them as they were without trying to change them. And that combination is rare. So even when the avoidant moves forward in life, builds new routines, meets new people, and experiences new relationships, that one memory continues to exist, not as a painful wound, but as a soft imprint, a reminder of a connection that felt different from the rest. And because it was different, it becomes unforgettable. The avoidant may never say it out loud. They may never reach out. They may never admit that the memory still matters. But in quiet moments, when life slows down and distractions fade, the thought of that one person still returns, like a distant echo, gentle, persistent, and impossible to completely silence. And as time keeps moving forward, the avoidant slowly begins to understand something they couldn't see before. Life brings them different people, different relationships, different emotional experiences. Some are intense. Some are dramatic. Some are filled with passion, conflict, closeness, and distance, all mixed together. And through all of it, they start noticing a quiet pattern. No matter how many people they meet, no matter how many connections they try to build, there is still one memory that feels softer than the rest. One connection that never felt heavy. One person who never made them feel like they had run. That realization doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, almost invisibly. It shows up in small comparisons, in the way certain conversations feel exhausting, in the way some relationships feel like emotional obligations instead of natural connections. And in those moments, the avoidant begins to recognize what made that one person different. That person didn't feel like a cage. They didn't feel like pressure. They didn't feel like someone trying to pull emotions out of them before they were ready. They felt like open space, like fresh air, like someone who understood silence without turning it into a problem. And that's when the avoidant starts to see the truth. That person represented emotional freedom, not distance in a cold or detached way, but freedom in a peaceful, understanding way. The kind of freedom where they didn't have to pretend, where they didn't have to explain every thought or feeling, where they could exist exactly as they were without the fear of being judged or pushed. That kind of connection is rare for anyone, but for an avoidant, it's almost sacred. Because avoidants spend most of their lives protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm. They build walls, create distance, and rely on independence as a form of safety. So when someone comes along who makes connection feel easy instead of threatening, it leaves a deep emotional mark. Even if the avoidant never calls it love, even if they never admit it mattered, their heart still remembers the feeling. And over the years, that person becomes more than just a memory. They become a quiet reference point, a symbol of what connection can feel like when it's not forced, when it's not overwhelming, when it's not filled with pressure and expectation. And even if the avoidant doesn't consciously search for that feeling, part of them always does. Sometimes this realization brings a subtle sense of regret. Not dramatic regret, not the kind that leads to emotional confessions or sudden messages, but a quiet awareness, a soft thought that appears late at night or during moments of stillness, a thought that wonders what might have happened if fear hadn't taken control, if they had stayed a little longer, if they had opened up just a little more, if they had allowed themselves to feel safe instead of running from it. But avoidants rarely act on those thoughts. Their instinct is still to protect themselves, to stay independent, to avoid emotional risks. So the memory remains exactly where it has always been inside their mind, untouched, unspoken, and quietly alive. And this is why the obsession doesn't look like obsession at all. There are no dramatic love stories, no desperate attempts to reconnect, no emotional breakdowns. Instead, it's a silent attachment, the kind that exists in passing thoughts, subtle comparisons, and quiet moments of reflection. The avoidant continues with life, but that one person stays with them in a way no one else does. Even when they enter new relationships, that memory still shapes their behavior. They become more cautious when someone gets too close, more distant when emotions become intense, and deep inside, they're still searching for that same sense of calm they once felt, that same emotional freedom. But because they never fully acknowledge what that connection meant, they struggle to recreate it. And the truth is, many avoidants never realize why that one person stays in their mind. They don't connect it to safety. They don't connect it to freedom. They just know that some memories fade and one doesn't. Some faces blur over time, and one stays clear. Some connections feel replaceable, and one feels strangely permanent. That's the hidden reality of the avoidant heart. It doesn't attach in loud or obvious ways. It doesn't hold on to the people who loved the hardest or tried the most. It holds on to the one who felt like peace, the one who didn't push, the one who didn't demand, the one who allowed connection to exist without turning it into pressure. And the shocking truth is, that person often never knows the impact they had. They may walk away thinking they were just another chapter, just another face in the avoidance life. They may believe they didn't matter as much as others, but deep inside the avoidance quiet world, they became something rare, a memory tied to safety, a symbol of emotional freedom, a presence that felt calm in a mind that is usually full of silent storms. So if you've ever been that person, the one who didn't chase, didn't pressure, didn't demand, you may have left a deeper mark than you realize. Not because you tried harder, not because you loved more intensely, but because you made connection feel safe. And for an avoidant, safety is the one thing their heart never forgets. Even if years pass, even if life changes, even if they never say a word, that quiet obsession often stays with them silently for far longer than anyone would ever expect.